Guy comes to you with a claim. He says, I was reading this book the other day, and the dude in the book said X. And you think to yourself, wait a second. X seems to go against everything that I've always understood to be true. So you look into it, you come back to the guy later, you say, hey, man, I checked, and as near as I can tell, your book was wrong, and the truth is actually Y. Now, of course, he doesn't believe you. He says, well, the guy that wrote this book is a PhD, and you're just some person. Of course, you have to admit that you are indeed just some person, but you also point out that the vast majority of the people with PhDs in relevant fields disagree with X. Almost all of them seem to think Y, as a matter of fact. What's more, all the ones that are respected in the field and hold teaching positions at major universities and stuff, they all say Y. Now, as I'm sure you know, this is where you get the conspiracy theory, right? This is where the guy explains that there's a centuries-long effort to discredit anybody who ever says X, so most of the academics in the field are too worried about their reputation to dispute Y. Plus, there's been an effort to suppress the data that would definitively prove X for a long time. Now, let's solve for X. I can plug a lot of things in there that would leave pretty much everybody in the audience nodding along, right? I mean, if X is creationism and Y is evolution, or if Y is climate change and X is denialism, or if X is any kind of alternative medical treatment or radical reinterpretation of basic physics, virtually everybody listening would nod along and say, yeah, I've been there one too many times. Motivated fucking reasoning. But in this instance, a lot of our listeners are going to hiss and boo because in this instance, X is mythicism. So now that I've pissed off a significant percentage of our listenership, but before I offer any justification, let me back up a bit and make sure we're all on the same page, right? So mythicism is the assertion that Jesus never lived. Mythicists would tell you that there was never a guy named Yeshua that was crucified by Pontius Pilate, that there were never any disciples. All of it was a myth that over time got treated like a historical event. Euhemerization, I believe, is the term. And as I'm sure is obvious from the introduction, I personally am not a mythicist. I'll freely admit that I'm no expert in the subject after reading a book on either side of the argument, but until recently, I've been awfully sympathetic to the claim, and I've been guilty of treating it with a bit more legitimacy than I feel like it merits. I mean, I want him to be right. Nothing could take the wind out of Christianity's sails like proving that the whole thing was based on a bedtime story that somebody mistook for the truth. Not to mention it'd be fucking hilarious. But as near as I can determine, the evidence just isn't on the mythicist side. And again, I'm no expert here. I'm sure a lot of people listening have looked way deeper into this issue than I have, and many of them, after that deep dive into the evidence, are convinced by the mythicist argument. And I'm not, going to fault them for that, because they might be right, But I've got a heuristic that I use in situations like this. When there's disagreement among qualified experts, I generally defer to the consensus view, especially if it's an overwhelming consensus. And now look, I'll admit that's a heuristic. That makes it imperfect. It's going to fail me from time to time, but most of the time it's going to land me on the right answer. See, to be perfectly honest, until I started looking into this issue, I had no idea how historians went about determining if a person really existed or not. Almost everything I know about the subject is something that I learned while examining this question. And as convincing as many of the mythicist arguments seem to me as a layperson, I have to temper that with the fact that they haven't convinced many of the qualified experts. Right? There are a few notable exceptions, obviously, but I wasn't able to find a single historian in a relevant field that held a teaching position at any university I'd ever heard of in the country that supported the mythicist position. And until now, I've been really sympathetic to the mythicist viewpoint on this show. I've been unconvinced myself, but I've still largely treated it like it was an open question, and I got called out on that recently by a listener, and I named the listener, but I always fuck Chetil's name up, so I'm just going to call him a listener. He urged me to do a deeper dive and at least acknowledge that the mythicist viewpoint isn't taken seriously in academia, and as near as I can tell, he's right. And what's more, the arguments he was offering me were ultimately the same arguments I generally use with creationists who are trying to deny evolution. Now, I want to be clear. I'm not trying to equate the two. If you looked into this subject and you find the mythicist argument persuasive, I'm not going to tell you they're wrong. Like I said, I don't know. I'm just going with the consensus view of the experts here, and I've already admitted that that could be incorrect. But we should be damn careful, myself foremost, to make sure that we're keeping this theory in its proper context. After all, Christians are dying to goad us into a fight that they can win, and this is a fight they can win. The vast majority of the evidence is on their side. The vast majority of even atheist historians agree that Jesus is based on a historical figure. The people on the mythicist side are largely unknown outside of mythicist circles. This is a losing battle. Now, that's not to say it's not a valuable question to explore. It could be, but we need to do so with the acknowledgement that most people in the field think of this as a fringe theory, and we need to communicate that fact. Hell, I got an email from a listener a while back who was flabbergasted when he learned that the vast majority of historians agree that Jesus was a real dude, because he learned that mid-debate with a theist. That's pretty fucking awkward, and I'm sure that that's the byproduct of the fact that atheists are way more sympathetic to mythicism and far more likely to accept it than most laypeople and most historians. But now that's not to say that the history isn't on our side here, right? Because while virtually all the historians seem to agree that the Jesus story was based on a real guy, they also virtually all agree that the story itself is a myth, right? And the historical Jesus was a homeless, ranting, violent, angry communist whose family thought he was crazy. He was an apocalyptic preacher whose claims are completely disproven simply by the fact that we're talking about him 2,000 years later on an undestroyed earth. In other words, one of the best arguments the atheists have against the truth of Christianity is the historical Jesus, so I'm not going out of my way to give him up.